It was a quiet Saturday morning when I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood that would soon become my new home. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and distant sprinklers ticking rhythmically. My new property sat on the edge of a cul-de-sac, a beautiful, oak-lined street with carefully manicured lawns and houses that all seemed to look the same. The kind of place where everyone waved politely, but kept a watchful eye on who did or didn't belong. I had just closed on the house a few days earlier. Papers were signed, keys were in my pocket, but I hadn't yet moved in. My schedule as a district judge kept me busy: cases, hearings, reviews. But that morning, I finally had time to breathe. I parked a few blocks away to stretch my legs, taking in the sights of what I thought would be a peaceful, welcoming community. But peace is a fragile illusion in neighborhoods run by people who mistake control for order. As I strolled past identical mailboxes and approved hedges trimmed with military precision, I noticed the familiar signs of HOA enforcement: laminated notices taped to gates, matching house numbers, a community bulletin board warning residents to report any suspicious activity. It felt less like a neighborhood and more like a gated experiment in paranoia. Still, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. After all, every HOA had its quirks. I turned down the street where my house stood: 2 stories, light gray paint, and a neat white fence that framed a modest front yard. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, looking over the property lines, planning where I'd put the flower beds, maybe a small patio in the back. That was when I heard the distinct sound of a golf cart approaching. The hum grew louder, followed by the crunch of tires on asphalt. Then, the cart stopped just behind me. Even without turning around, I could feel the energy shift, the kind of self-importance that only comes from someone who believes they're in charge. A woman cleared her throat. Her voice had that sharp, performative politeness people use when they're about to accuse you of something. I didn't respond. I simply stepped closer to the property, still examining the front yard. The woman, from what I could tell through peripheral glances, was in her mid-50s. Perfectly pressed blouse, clipboard in hand, sunglasses that covered half her face, the unofficial uniform of HOA power. Her tone grew more assertive. I could hear her radio crackle as she muttered something about a suspicious male loitering. I continued to ignore her. After all, I wasn't breaking any law, and technically, I owned the very land she was accusing me of trespassing on. But curiosity got the better of her, or maybe her ego did, and she demanded that I identify myself. I turned, finally meeting her gaze. For a split second, she hesitated, unsure whether to back down or double down. She chose the latter. She said I was trespassing on private HOA property and that she had already called security. I almost laughed, but I remained calm, studying her demeanor. She wasn't just confident. She was convinced she was right. Minutes later, a white SUV marked Neighborhood Patrol rolled up. A man stepped out wearing a badge that looked more decorative than official, but he carried himself like law enforcement. They conferred briefly before approaching me together. The woman pointed in my direction, animated and triumphant, as if she'd just solved a mystery. The guard announced that I was being detained for trespassing on private grounds. He said it in a rehearsed, official tone that carried just enough authority to sound serious, the kind of tone used to intimidate rather than inform. I let them speak. I let them feel the weight of their own assumptions. Then, without a word, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a slim leather folder. Inside were the freshly signed documents of ownership: title deed, closing confirmation, everything. I opened it, showed it briefly, then tucked it back in place. The woman squinted, leaning closer, as if trying to decipher whether it was real. But before she could ask, the sound of a police cruiser echoed down the street. Apparently, she hadn't just called security. She'd called the actual police. 2 officers arrived, young, polite, and clearly aware they were walking into a petty neighborhood dispute. They approached cautiously, speaking to the woman first. I watched as she spun her story, gesturing wildly toward me, claiming I'd jumped the fence and was acting suspiciously near a home that wasn't mine. The officers nodded politely but looked unconvinced. When they turned to me, I presented my ID, my state-issued judicial identification. It bore my name, photo, and title. Their posture changed instantly. One of them blinked twice, then carefully handed it back, murmuring a quick apology. The woman looked confused, then irritated, demanding to know why they weren't arresting me. They didn't answer her directly. Instead, one officer explained, in the calm, deliberate tone of someone trying to defuse a ticking bomb, that I was the legal owner of the property. Her expression shifted from confusion to horror to disbelief. She tried to recover, muttering something about misunderstandings and safety protocols, but the damage was already done. As the police left, I simply stood there, silent, letting the moment sink in. The woman sputtered a half-hearted apology, but I could see in her eyes she wasn't sorry. She was embarrassed, furious that her authority had been challenged and shattered so publicly. I didn't bother correcting her further. I knew enough about people like her. The ones who hide behind rules they barely understand, who crave power without purpose. This wouldn't be the last time she tried to assert her control. I took one last look at the property before walking away. My first day in the neighborhood had already turned into a spectacle. The HOA had made an enemy out of the one person who could actually hold them accountable, but they didn't know that yet. As I reached my car, I could still hear her muttering to the patrol officer, trying to justify herself, trying to rewrite what had just happened. I smiled faintly. She could say whatever she wanted. Soon enough, the truth and the law would speak louder than her clipboard ever could. That morning walk had shown me more about the HOA than any welcome brochure ever could. And as I drove away, I realized something that made me laugh quietly to myself. They hadn't just accused a homeowner of trespassing. They'd tried to arrest the very judge who could shut their entire operation down. I didn't plan revenge. Not yet. But I did plan to stay. Because some battles don't need to be fought with anger. Some are best won with patience, paperwork, and perfect timing. And I had all three. The following Monday, the incident still echoed through the neighborhood like a whispered scandal. I hadn't even officially moved in yet, but my name was already being passed around like a warning. The man who trespassed, the stranger who caused a scene, the one who embarrassed the HOA president in front of the police. The HOA board moved quickly to reclaim their narrative. They distributed an email blast to all residents, thinly veiled under the subject line, Community Safety Reminder. It warned about unknown individuals entering private property without authorization and encouraged everyone to remain vigilant. Of course, they never mentioned me by name, but the implication was clear. I received that same email, copied automatically to all homeowners, and read it over my morning coffee with quiet amusement. The tone was defensive, desperate to reassert control. But beneath the polished wording, I saw fear. Not fear of safety, but fear of exposure. They had no idea who I was, and that ignorance was about to cost them. Before the day ended, I drafted a letter, professional, precise, and restrained. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. The letter was addressed to the HOA Board of Directors and outlined, in unemotional legal language, the following points. I was the lawful owner of the property at 219 Oak Bend Drive. I had been publicly accused of criminal trespassing on my own property. Members of the HOA had involved law enforcement without verifying ownership. Any further harassment or defamation could constitute actionable misconduct. I ended the letter with a polite note, suggesting that the HOA review its enforcement procedures to ensure compliance with state property laws and fair treatment of residents. Beneath my signature, I included my full professional title, Honorable Daniel Mercer, District Court Judge. It wasn't a boast. It was context. 2 days later, I received a response, not in writing, but in behavior. The HOA president, The same woman who'd called the police suddenly began making rounds through the neighborhood, smiling tightly and greeting everyone she saw. Her tone had shifted from authoritarian to almost nauseatingly pleasant. But when she passed by my property, she avoided eye contact. I watched from a distance as she slowed her golf cart, hesitated at the edge of my driveway, then turned around without stopping. I could almost see the panic spinning behind those dark sunglasses. By the end of the week, a formal apology letter arrived, printed on embossed stationery with the HOA logo at the top. It was filled with flowery language about miscommunication, unfortunate misunderstandings, and community unity. It didn't admit fault, but it practically bled with discomfort. The signature at the bottom, Margaret Ellison, HOA president, trembled slightly, as though written under duress. I could have accepted it and let things settle, but I didn't, because something about that weekend encounter had stuck with me. The way she spoke with certainty, the way she weaponized rules she didn't even understand. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about how many others she had treated the same way. So, I started reading. Every HOA has a set of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, as they're called, a sprawling web of fine print dictating everything from mailbox color to fence height. Most residents never bother to read them. I did. I spent several nights going through every clause, every signature, every outdated amendment. What I found was worse than I expected. Half of the board's enforcement policies were outdated or unenforceable under current state statutes. The HOA was collecting maintenance fees for amenities that no longer existed. Their parking enforcement policy directly contradicted county zoning laws. Even their election procedures for board members were questionable at best. A handful of people reappointing themselves every year without any oversight. It was a house of cards built on arrogance and neglect. I didn't act immediately. Judges learn patience, the art of letting truth ripen before revealing it. Instead, I began observing, quietly, methodically. Every time I walked through the neighborhood, I noticed how certain residents avoided the board's officers, how they whispered complaints when the president's golf cart passed. There was resentment beneath the surface, a silent majority tired of being bullied. A week later, I received a second notice from the HOA. This time, it wasn't about me directly. It was a violation warning for improper landscaping. The irony was that I hadn't even moved in yet. My front yard was empty, bare soil and 2 neglected shrubs from the previous owner. The notice claimed I was in violation of aesthetic standards and would be fined if I didn't install approved foliage within 10 days. It was laughable, but it also told me everything I needed to know. The board wasn't afraid, not yet. They thought they could intimidate me back into submission. That same afternoon, I paid a visit to the HOA office, located in a converted clubhouse near the entrance of the neighborhood. Inside, the decor was sterile, beige walls, laminate counters, and motivational posters about community harmony. Margaret was there, her smile stretched too thin. She stood up the moment she saw me, her voice rehearsed and falsely cheerful. I handed her the violation notice. She stammered something about automatic enforcement and routine procedure, but her composure cracked when I asked for the meeting minutes from the last board election. Her expression froze. She didn't expect anyone to ask for that, certainly not someone with the authority to understand what those records implied. After a long silence, she said she'd check with the board about releasing them. I nodded and left without another word. That night, a different kind of quiet settled over the neighborhood. I could feel eyes watching from behind curtains as I walked to my car. Word was spreading again. Only this time, not about a trespassing incident, but about the homeowner who dared to question the HOA itself. The following morning, I drafted another letter, this one shorter, but far more pointed. It requested full transparency on the HOA's financial and procedural operations, as required under state statute. I gave them 7 days to comply, 7 days to come clean. I wasn't angry. I was deliberate. Every sentence, every motion, every step was precise. They wanted to play authority? I would show them what real authority looked like: quiet, patient, and inevitable. As the week drew on, whispers turned into tension. Residents began greeting me differently, cautiously, but with something new in their eyes: hope. Maybe they didn't know the details, but they sensed change stirring. The HOA board, meanwhile, scrambled behind closed doors. Meetings ran late. Notices appeared and disappeared. The same golf cart that once patrolled with pride now moved nervously, its driver avoiding certain streets entirely. The clock was ticking, and they knew it. By the seventh day, no response came. No documents. No transparency. No accountability. That silence was all the confirmation I needed. They'd drawn their line. Now it was my turn. The seventh day passed without a word from the HOA. No apology. No documents. Not even an acknowledgement of my formal request. It was predictable, almost disappointing in its arrogance. Most boards like this operated under the illusion that they were untouchable, that their little corner of authority insulated them from real law. But I knew better. I'd seen the same arrogance crumble in courtrooms. And this time, I wasn't sitting behind the bench. I was standing in the field, watching the cracks widen beneath them. I decided to begin my investigation quietly. My judicial position gave me access to certain public records, and while I had to remain professional and avoid direct conflict of interest, nothing stopped me from reviewing publicly available filings. Homeowners associations are required by law to register their financial and operational reports with the county. So I began there. What I found was revealing. The HOA's registration had been renewed annually, but always late, sometimes by months. Their treasurer, a man named Richard Harlan, had filed incomplete statements for 3 consecutive years. The association's declared reserve fund, which was supposed to maintain community facilities, had been drained nearly to zero. Yet, residents were still paying full fees. The more I read, the more the puzzle pieces aligned. The HOA wasn't just disorganized, it was rotten. Funds were missing, elections were irregular, and contracts were being awarded to companies suspiciously connected to certain board members. The following weekend, I began speaking with residents, subtly, conversationally. I wasn't looking for gossip. I was looking for patterns. I met an older couple who lived across the street. Kind people who had stopped maintaining their garden after the HOA fined them twice for using unapproved mulch. They told me how Margaret, the HOA president, had her own lawn service, a company that conveniently held the community's exclusive landscaping contract. A young family a few houses down mentioned how they'd been fined for parking their minivan in their own driveway overnight. The same rule, they said, didn't seem to apply to certain board members. One story led to another. The HOA, it seemed, had long ruled through intimidation, selective enforcement, fabricated violations, and threats of liens against anyone who resisted. People complied not because they agreed, but because they were tired of fighting. I could sense the fatigue in their voices, the quiet resignation. It reminded me of witnesses in court who'd been mistreated so long they no longer believed justice existed. That realization solidified my decision. This wasn't about one overzealous president anymore. It was about systemic abuse disguised as community management. I returned home that evening and began organizing everything I'd learned. Documents, testimonies, financial records, a growing file of evidence that painted a clear picture of misconduct. I didn't need to act as a judge in this situation. I only needed to act as a resident who knew how to navigate the law. A few days later, I received another envelope from the HOA. This one was noticeably thicker than the previous ones. Inside was a notice of noncompliance, a multi-page citation accusing me of several violations, including failure to submit landscaping plans, lack of approved outdoor lighting, and obstruction of community standards. It was absurd, almost laughable, but it was also a sign of panic. They were trying to intimidate me, to remind me that they still believed they held power. I filed the notice neatly in my folder, next to the letter I'd sent them 2 weeks earlier, the one they'd ignored. The pattern was clear: harassment as a defensive mechanism. It was the behavior of people who knew they were losing control. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I made another quiet move: a formal records request to the County Property Commission. I wanted access to all HOA filings, permits, and business licenses associated with Oak Bend Estates. The request came back within days. The documents confirmed my suspicions. The HOA had been operating under an expired maintenance permit for nearly 2 years. Their landscaping contractor, registered under the name Greenleaf Services, was owned by none other than Margaret's husband. And the most damning discovery of all, the HOA had failed to hold a legally recognized board election in over 4 years. By law, any association that fails to hold proper elections forfeits its authority to levy fines or enforce regulations until governance is restored. In other words, the HOA's power was not only weak, it was void. I sat back in my chair, reading that last clause twice, letting the words sink in. For months, perhaps years, this group had bullied residents with fake authority. And now, the very laws they'd used to control others would dismantle them. But it wasn't time to strike yet. Not publicly. I knew their kind too well. Confrontation would only make them defensive, maybe even reckless. No, I needed them to reveal their arrogance completely, to expose themselves. So I waited. And right on cue, they gave me exactly what I needed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I found a paper taped to my front door. It was a final warning. The letter declared that due to continued noncompliance, the HOA would be scheduling a hearing to determine further penalties, including possible legal escalation. The irony was delicious. They wanted to bring me to a hearing. The notice was signed by the HOA's disciplinary committee, an unofficial subgroup that had no legal standing whatsoever. It was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. I smiled as I folded the paper. The trap had set itself. The next few days, I made no mention of it. I went about my work, attended court sessions, and spent evenings preparing documents. I gathered every record, every discrepancy, every county filing. I even printed out excerpts from the state statutes that governed HOAs. By the time Thursday arrived, I was ready. The clubhouse was already buzzing when I walked in. The same residents who had whispered their frustrations now sat silently in folding chairs, watching as the board prepared to humiliate me. Margaret sat at the center of the long table, her clipboard stacked with papers, her expression sharp with confidence. She had no idea the walls around her were already crumbling. As I took a seat, the room fell quiet. Margaret cleared her throat and began reading from a prepared statement about ongoing violations and community integrity. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to mask it. I said nothing. I only waited, patient and composed, while she outlined the accusations against me, accusations that had no legal basis. When she finally finished, I opened my folder, slowly, deliberately. The sound of the papers shifting filled the silence. I began placing documents on the table one by one: ownership deeds, correspondence logs, county filings, financial discrepancies, expired permits, and a copy of the state statute regarding HOA governance. The expressions around the room changed as I laid out the evidence. Curiosity turned to confusion, confusion to disbelief, disbelief to realization. Then I spoke, calmly, clearly, not as a homeowner defending himself, but as someone revealing the truth. I didn't accuse. I explained. I outlined how their authority was invalid, their fines unenforceable, their elections illegal. I showed the dates, the missing signatures, the conflicts of interest. I spoke not with anger, but with precision, the way one might dismantle a structure beam by beam until it collapsed under its own weight. When I was done, the room was silent. Margaret's face had drained of color. Her hand trembled slightly as she clutched the edge of the table. She muttered something about misinterpretation, but no one listened. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, they seemed to realize the depth of their mistakes. I didn't stay to watch them crumble further. I simply gathered my papers, nodded to the room, and left. Outside, the night air was cool and still. The stars were faint behind the streetlights, and the neighborhood that had once seemed so controlled now felt open, uncertain, on the edge of change. I knew the real storm hadn't hit yet. They would resist. They always did. But now, the foundation had cracked, and it was only a matter of time before the entire structure fell apart. And I would be there to make sure it fell the right way, legally, properly, and completely. The night after the hearing was quiet, too quiet. The neighborhood that once hummed with the predictable rhythm of sprinklers, garage doors, and dog walkers now carried a strange tension, a silence thick enough to feel. Word of what had happened at the clubhouse had spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. By sunrise, nearly every resident knew the story. The HOA's authority had been publicly dismantled by the very man they had tried to fine, threaten, and humiliate. But while many residents were quietly thrilled, the board was not defeated. Not yet. The next morning, a new email appeared in my inbox. Its subject line was short and defensive: clarification on recent misunderstandings. The message inside was a blend of denial and desperation. It claimed that my interpretation of HOA law was incomplete and that the board would be reviewing the matter with external legal counsel. It was the classic move of cornered authority: refuse accountability, stall for time, and hope intimidation would still work. But intimidation doesn't work on someone who's seen it all before. As the days passed, the board's behavior shifted from avoidance to retaliation. The first sign was subtle: a stack of anonymous complaint forms filed against me. Someone had reported my excessive noise from non-existent late-night gatherings. Another accused me of illegally modifying my property, even though I hadn't so much as planted a flower yet. Each claim was baseless, but the pattern was deliberate. Then came the second move: the HOA's legal letter. It arrived folded in a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the logo of a local law firm. The tone inside was sharp and performative. The letter accused me of defamation, interference with association governance, and unauthorized access to privileged information. It demanded that I cease publicly disparaging the HOA and retract my false statements. The irony was nearly comedic. I hadn't said a single false word. Every statement I made had been supported by the HOA's own documents. But they weren't trying to win legally. They were trying to scare me into silence. They had picked the wrong target. I read the letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it beside my growing stack of evidence. Then, I did what I always do when faced with aggression disguised as authority. I stayed quiet and let them speak louder. Because people like that always reveal more when they believe they're still in control. Over the next week, the board's actions grew increasingly erratic. Security patrols began circling my property more frequently. The same golf cart that once delivered smug warnings now lingered just long enough to be noticed. I could see Margaret at the wheel some evenings, her expression tight and watchful. Residents noticed, too. The whispers that once surrounded me had turned into open conversations. People stopped me on my walks, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. They asked questions about their fines, about their rights, about whether what the HOA had done was even legal. It was clear the board had lost its grip on fear. The breaking point came when a small group of homeowners decided to hold their own meeting separate from the HOA. They invited me, not as a judge, but as a neighbor. The gathering took place in a quiet backyard, under the soft glow of patio lights. No formalities, no clipboards, no signatures, just residents talking freely for the first time in years. What they shared that night painted a damning portrait. One family revealed they'd been charged late fees on dues they'd already paid, with no way to appeal. Another elderly resident explained how the board threatened to place a lien on her home for not painting her shutters the approved beige shade fast enough. Someone else mentioned that a neighbor's pool permit was revoked after he refused to donate to the HOA's beautification fund. Every story followed the same pattern: abuse of power disguised as policy. By the end of the evening, the conversation shifted from frustration to action. They wanted to know what could be done. Could the HOA be audited? Could the board be dissolved? Could the residents reclaim control of their own community? I told them, carefully and calmly, that the answer to all three questions was yes. They didn't cheer. They didn't even smile. They just nodded, a quiet, collective understanding passing between them. For the first time, the residents realized they weren't powerless. The next morning, Margaret must have sensed the shift, because the retaliation turned personal. I woke to find a large violation notice taped across my garage door, bright red ink, bold font, impossible to miss. It accused me of conduct unbecoming of a community member and threatened further legal consequences. I took it down without a word. But that single act, ripping their warning from my property, felt like the final rejection of their control. Later that day, I received an email from the same law firm that had sent the earlier letter. Only this time, the tone was different, measured, cautious, almost nervous. They requested a discussion to resolve recent misunderstandings. That told me everything I needed to know. The HOA's legal counsel had finally realized who they were dealing with. The firm's senior partner, a man I'd encountered in court before, likely recognized my name. He would have looked it up, seen the district, the cases, the authority. And then, he would have called Margaret and told her the one thing she never wanted to hear: that she had picked a fight she couldn't win. But Margaret wasn't someone who surrendered gracefully. That evening, just after sunset, I saw her standing at the edge of my driveway, clipboard in hand, arms crossed. Her expression was that familiar mask of superiority. But this time, it cracked around the edges. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The tension between us said everything. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a rule breaker or a trespasser. She was looking at the person who had taken her power away. And she knew it. The following morning, the neighborhood felt different. The usual patrols were gone. The HOA office was locked, blinds drawn. Residents were gathering in small clusters, whispering and comparing stories. Something was shifting beneath the surface, something irreversible. Then came the email that changed everything. It arrived mid-afternoon with the subject line, "Emergency HOA Meeting." The message declared that due to recent disruptions, the board would be holding a private session to discuss ongoing threats to the association's stability. Only board members were invited, no residents. That was their final mistake. By law, HOA meetings must be open to all members except under specific, documented circumstances. Holding a private emergency session without notice violated their own bylaws and the state's HOA transparency statute. They were trying to hide, which meant I was getting close. That night, as the clubhouse lights flickered behind the drawn blinds, I sat in my study reviewing everything I'd gathered: documents, testimonies, financial records, statutes, all laid out neatly in folders across my desk. I didn't need revenge. I needed resolution. The board had crossed every legal and ethical line, and the residents deserved better. There was a process to dismantle an HOA when it became corrupt, and I knew exactly how to begin it. Tomorrow, I would make it official. The HOA had tried to silence me with warnings, fines, and empty threats. Now, I would silence them with the law they had so carelessly ignored. And this time, there would be no golf carts, no warnings, no fake authority. Only truth, paper, and consequence. Morning sunlight poured through the blinds, casting thin golden lines across my desk, lines that fell over a growing mountain of documents, evidence, and reports. It had been weeks since the first confrontation, and the quiet suburban street outside my window no longer looked the same. Lawns were still trimmed, hedges still perfect, But beneath that manicured order, the neighborhood had fractured. Half the residents now saw the HOA for what it truly was: a small circle of power-hungry individuals who had mistaken control for community. The other half, mostly those who benefited from the board's favoritism, clung to denial, whispering that everything would go back to normal. But I knew the truth. Nothing was going back. The HOA's collapse wasn't just inevitable, it was already in motion. The first domino fell quietly. A resident named Mrs. Davenport, who had lived here for over 20 years, discovered discrepancies in her billing records. Year after year, she had paid her dues early, but somehow the HOA ledger showed late payments, each incurring fines. When she requested proof, she received only vague responses. I helped her file a formal financial disclosure request, a right guaranteed under state HOA law. When the board failed to comply within the required time frame, I filed a complaint through the county's property oversight office, an action that triggered a mandatory audit. And just like that, the board's fortress began to crack. The auditors moved quickly, pulling bank statements, transaction records, and internal communications. Within days, irregularities began to surface. Maintenance expenses that had no invoices, community events that never took place, and perhaps most damning, contractor payments to a company that didn't exist except on paper. Margaret's signature appeared on nearly every authorization form. When the audit findings reached the county attorney's desk, the response was immediate. An official notice was sent to the HOA. Cease all financial operations pending review. For the first time in years, the HOA couldn't issue fines, fees, or penalties. Their power had been frozen. But Margaret didn't take it quietly. She sent out a neighborhood-wide email claiming that outsiders were attacking the community and that malicious actors were trying to dismantle what they had worked so hard to build. The residents didn't buy it. Not anymore. The next evening, someone posted a printed copy of the audit notice on the clubhouse door for everyone to see. By dawn, nearly the entire neighborhood had seen the truth in black and white. The HOA wasn't protecting them, it was exploiting them. That same day, a motion to recall the entire board began circulating. It needed only 51% of resident signatures to take effect. By nightfall, it had 73%. Margaret and her allies tried one last act of defiance. They called a special session at the clubhouse, announcing they would address the false allegations. But when the meeting started, it wasn't residents who walked through the door. It was two county investigators, armed with files, cameras, and a stack of warrants. I wasn't there to gloat. I stayed home, sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching from a distance as the blue and white cars pulled up. I could hear faint voices, sharp tones, the echo of argument and denial. And then silence. When the investigators left an hour later, Margaret was standing alone on the clubhouse steps, her once pristine clipboard now hanging loosely at her side. She looked small, almost fragile, as if the weight of all her certainty had finally collapsed under the truth. That evening, the community mailbox was unusually busy. Residents stood in small clusters, talking in low voices. For the first time, they weren't afraid to speak. They talked about everything, about the fines that had drained their savings, the humiliation of being policed by their own neighbors, the fear of retaliation for simply questioning authority. And as they spoke, something began to shift. The HOA had thrived on isolation, keeping residents divided, compliant, uncertain. But now, the silence had broken, and with it, the illusion of control. Days later, a formal announcement arrived from the county office. Due to confirmed financial misconduct and procedural violations, the current HOA board is hereby dissolved pending reformation. It was over. The HOA, as it had existed, no longer held legal authority. Its bank accounts were frozen, its bylaws suspended. Margaret and her fellow board members were barred from holding any position of community governance. But victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt solemn. As I walked through the neighborhood the next morning, I saw people cleaning their driveways, trimming hedges, waving at one another again. No patrol carts, no warning letters, no fear. It was as though the community had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Some residents approached me to thank me, but I reminded them it wasn't my doing, it was theirs. I may have understood the law, but they had found their courage. That evening, the neighborhood held a gathering, not a formal meeting, just a celebration. Tables were set up on the cul-de-sac, lights strung between mailboxes, music playing softly in the background. Children rode their bikes freely, something the HOA had once fined parents for allowing. For the first time since I'd moved in, I saw what this place could be, a real community. Still, one thing lingered. Despite the board's dissolution, there was unfinished business. The audit had revealed deeper issues: misappropriated funds, false records, and potential criminal conduct. Margaret hadn't acted alone, and the law doesn't stop at exposure. Justice wasn't about humiliation, it was about consequence. And that was my next responsibility. As I looked out over the smiling faces, the laughter, and the sound of life returning to normal, I knew my work wasn't done yet. The neighborhood had won back its freedom, but the story wasn't complete until accountability had its final say. The HOA's fall was a victory, but the reckoning had just begun. And soon, every person who used their position to manipulate, intimidate, or exploit this community would stand where they had once placed others, on the receiving end of judgment. The difference was, this time, the judgment would be fair. The morning of the hearing arrived with the kind of stillness that only comes before something final. Clouds hung low over the courthouse. A gray ceiling stretched across the city. I parked in my usual spot, gathered my brief, and walked through the wide glass doors. Just another day at work, though the case I was about to preside over was anything but ordinary. It had been months since the audit that dismantled the HOA. The neighborhood had changed in ways that were subtle but profound. People spoke to one another again. Children played outside without fear of complaints. The lawns weren't all identical shades of green anymore, but there was life in that imperfection. It felt human again, and yet the past hadn't vanished. The county's investigation into the HOA's finances had uncovered more than mismanagement. It revealed a web of deceit, misuse of funds, and deliberate coercion. Margaret's board hadn't just overstepped, it had committed fraud. The case had landed, by random assignment, in my own jurisdiction. Ethics demanded I recuse myself from any proceeding involving my own neighborhood, and I did. But the court system moves in strange, winding ways. My duty that day wasn't to judge the defendants. It was to hear the final procedural appeal, one that would determine whether the case would go to full criminal trial or be settled with restitution. As I took my seat, I saw familiar faces in the gallery. Residents from the community, scattered across the benches, their expressions a mixture of anger, anticipation, and quiet relief. And there, at the defense table, sat Margaret. Gone was the pastel cardigan, the tight bun, the clipboard clutched like a weapon. She looked smaller somehow, her posture folded inward, eyes fixed on the table before her. Around her sat two of her former board members, equally subdued. The attorneys made their arguments, procedural, technical, emotionless. Words like misallocation, unauthorized disbursement, and fiduciary breach filled the air. But underneath that sterile language lay something deeper: betrayal. The residents had trusted the board to protect their homes, their sense of belonging, and their peace. Instead, they had been ruled through fear and greed. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. Bank statements showing thousands of dollars redirected to personal accounts. HOA funds spent on consulting fees to a company run by a relative of a board member. Even invoices for security patrols that had never existed. By the time the defense rested, the outcome was clear. The appeal for leniency was denied. The case would proceed to full trial with formal criminal charges. Margaret and the others would have their day in court, but this time not as accusers or enforcers. This time as defendants. As the hearing concluded, Margaret looked up. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no anger in hers, no defiance. Only the hollow recognition of someone who had finally realized the cost of what she'd done. I gavelled the session closed. The sound echoed like the end of something much larger than a legal proceeding. It was the closing note of a story that had begun months ago on a quiet suburban street, with a clipboard, a warning, and an accusation of trespassing. Outside the courthouse, the residents gathered in the courtyard. Some thanked me, others just nodded. They didn't need speeches or grand gestures. They'd lived through enough of those. What they needed was closure, and today they had it. In the following weeks, restitution was ordered. The stolen funds were returned to the community account, supervised this time by an independent trustee. A new HOA was formed, smaller, transparent, run by volunteers who actually cared about their neighbors rather than controlling them. The new bylaws limited board authority, required public posting of every decision, and banned anonymous complaints. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And as the days turned into weeks, life in the neighborhood began to settle into something peaceful again. Lawns grew in their own way. Fences were painted in colors that reflected personality, not permission. The sound of children's laughter returned to the cul-de-sacs that had once echoed only with the hum of golf carts and the rustle of printed fines. I often sat on my porch in the evenings now, watching the sunset stretch across the rooftops. It was the same view as before, but somehow it looked freer. Sometimes, I'd see Margaret's old house down the street, its windows dark, the for sale sign swaying gently in the wind. No one had bought it yet. Maybe no one wanted to. Maybe it was better that way, a silent reminder of what happens when power replaces purpose. But this story wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about something much quieter: justice, fairness, the restoration of balance where it had been lost. People often think justice comes from the gavel, from the courtroom, from the final verdict. But sometimes it comes from the small moments. A neighbor who feels safe again, a family who can plant flowers without fear of a fine, a community that learns to govern itself with compassion instead of control. That's what real justice looks like. And so, the neighborhood lived on, not under the watchful eyes of clipboards and bylaws, but under the simple understanding that respect is stronger than rules, and community isn't built by fear, but by trust. Every story has an ending, but this one, I think, was really about beginnings. Because sometimes you have to tear down the walls of power to build something better behind them. And sometimes all it takes to do that is for the right person to walk through the wrong door at exactly the right time.